Hello, everyone. I'm Anne. I'm AIR's engagement strategist. Thank you for being here with us today, and I'm super excited to introduce you all to Amanda Hickman, who actually just joined us this week as a full staffer to serve as our first ever Director of Freelance Futures. And what that essentially means is that in this role, she will focus on the policies and practices that are actively shaping freelance opportunities, from tracking legislation to collecting industry data. Amanda will work to shape how we support freelance audio producers, which is super exciting for AIR and for our network. And many of you may already know Amanda from one-on-one phone calls or from her AIR daily posts, as she's been working to revise our Code of Fair Practices and rate card. So while we continue to work on the rate suggestions for 2019, we're very excited today to walk you through the 2019 Code of Fair Practices, which is a document that was originally created in 1999, revised in 2015, and then most recently revised through the help of an advisory group with Amanda's coordination and research in July of 2019. So before I shift the mic over to Amanda, I would like to ask that if you have questions during this webinar, feel free to use the Q&A submission button so that she can see it and answer it. Otherwise, if you put it in the chat box, it'll likely get lost in the conversation. So without further ado, I'm gonna turn the webinar over to Amanda Hickman.
Hi. So we are going to go over AIR's Code of Fair Practice and talk a little bit about how to use it to ensure that you are being treated fairly and not being taken advantage of, and also to help you set expectations and understand what shows and stations and podcast production houses can reasonably expect of you. So it's a good tool for getting folks on the same page. As Anne said, the first edition of this code was published in 1999. I think it's been revised a couple of times. The most recent revision was in 2015. And then I worked with a working group to finish the most recent revision of it this summer. The two most notable changes in this edition of the code is that for the first time, we explicitly assert that asking folks to work on spec isn't fair. And we assert that independent contributors should enjoy the same protection from harassment as staff do. We'll talk about both of those sections in a minute. But I don't know if folks are following along or not. There's actually some interesting legislative moves afoot to codify that last one, at least in New York State. So I want to start with a couple of caveats. First of all, the Code of Fair Practice is not binding. No one has made a commitment to adhere to the code. However, we believe that it does reflect widely accepted fair practice. You can see on the screen the names of the working group that worked on, put a huge amount, I can't even tell you how much work, but put a huge amount of work into reviewing iterations of and drafts of it, helping bring it up to what it is today. We also worked with representatives from an even larger group of networks. Some of them were shows, some of them were broadcast networks, some of them are podcast production houses. And while there are some points where there's not complete consensus, broadly, these folks all agree with us that this represents basic fair practice. The other really important thing to keep in mind is that not all people are good people. And this is one of the stories that I heard a lot as I was interviewing people and working towards getting this document finalized, was stories about someone who just wouldn't take no for an answer, or if you asked them for what you thought was fair, they would come back and instead of saying, I can't pay that, say, you're a horrible person for asking me for that. And I just think it's really important to keep in mind that you will always encounter people who turn into absolute bullies if you say no to them. Some people don't handle disappointment well. They make it about you when they can't get what they want. And the other thing that I just want to make sure people understand is that anyone, artists, web designers, roofing contractors, anyone who works directly with consumers has countless stories about people who want the moon for the price of a bag of chips and lose their mind when they can't have it. And so just a really important reminder that the code is a great resource for you to look back to when someone says you're asking for too much. But it's not going to prevent people from being rude when you tell them that you're not going to give them what they want. So just remember that when people tell you that they're bullies, believe them and walk away. The other really important caveat is that nothing in the code is a good substitute for having a direct conversation with the editor or producer who hired you. So when you take a commission, you should always be communicating with the folks who are paying for that commission to make sure that you're genuinely clear on everyone's expectations. So what is it good for? The first thing that the code is incredibly valuable for is setting expectations. When you're embarking on a new project, the code is a great roadmap for expectations to address in those first conversations. Some of the things that we flag within the code are questions like expenses. What are the expenses that you foresee on a project? Is it going to require travel? Is it going to require tape syncs? It's really valuable to get those things on the table early on, and to make sure that they're part of the conversation, and not to assume that an editor or commissioning entity of some sort is prepared to pay for whatever expenses you come up against, but rather to go into it assuming that they understand and you understand that your fee is in addition to any expenses, and it's up to you to estimate those expenses and come to an agreement with your producer about what's actually reasonable. It's always important to have conversations about what their expense policy is. What are their expenses about travel expenses? Do they generally fly business class or take the bus? In most cases, it's neither of those, but just making sure that you have some clearer conversations about what people are expecting and using the code as a kind of framework for guiding those conversations. One of the things that we flag in the code is the importance of a written agreement. And sometimes a show or a station, a production house, is not going to be forthcoming with a written agreement following a conversation. And one of the things that you can do very quickly is just at a minimum follow any phone call with a summary of what you agreed to. Thanks for chatting. Just to recap, this is what we agreed on. These are the dates, these are the expenses. Just to continually ensure that you're setting those expectations as you go. My little next button isn't working for me. Oh, sorry. Another really important value for the code, which is really an extension of setting expectations, is using the code to check your instincts. Are you asking for too much? Are you asking for not enough? One of the reporters I talked to while I was working on this update to the code told me they had a really hard time with the story because they underestimated the cost of cabs in a particular country. And they got stood up by a subject and had to repeat an expensive round trip cab ride several times. The total cost of that incident was about $150 to the reporter. And one of the things that we want to keep in mind is that it is reasonable to ask for expenses. And it's one of the reasons that we put that down in writing. And it's reasonable to go back to an editor and say, hey, I underestimated my expenses. It turns out that it's going to take a few more cab rides than I thought in this very expensive foreign country. And they may still say no. They may still say, you should have come to us with this earlier. But it's perfectly reasonable to ensure that your editor knows that you have expenses that you didn't foresee. And it's reasonable to ask them to pay you back for them. Other kinds of expectation and instinct questions. Can you resell a story if you got a kill fee? Yes, you can. If a station tells you that it's just their policy to ask for a blanket indemnification or that they only assign work on spec to new freelancers, the code is a good place to look for confirmation that this is not okay. And if you don't feel strong enough advocating for yourself, the code is a really valuable piece to lean on to say, hey, I don't think that's okay. And AIR agrees with me. The Code of Fair Practices says this. So again, as I said, it's not binding, but it's a nice anchor, especially when you get in those situations where you have an editor or producer saying, you're crazy. That's too much to ask for. the code is there to tell you that that's not at all too much to ask for. It's a reasonable ask. There are a couple of sections of the code that I think are really important, that assert that you as an outside contributor should have access to institutional policies on things like standards of reporting, transparency around compensation policies, and workplace harassment policies. I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of newsrooms and production houses might not be sufficiently organized internally to even have those documents. NPR obviously has explicit standards of reporting and ethics. Not everybody does. A brand new podcast house might not have gotten to that, or might not have prioritized that piece. But it's worth asking for those things, especially if you're new to working with an outlet, because that's another place where there's a whole set, where they have a whole set of policies in place, and you as an outside contributor need to know what they are, and not make assumptions about what their standards of reporting are. You as a reporter and as an outside contributor should have access to their workplace harassment policies. I will say that that is a particularly new assertion in the code. And we really do want to hear from folks, especially if you're having trouble exercising or accessing those policies. But again, sometimes it's just a reminder that this is something that you are entitled to ask for. And sometimes it's something you can lean on to say, hey, I asked for this and you said, no, I would never share that with you. And I'm going to point you to the Air Code of Fair Practice, which says that you absolutely should share it with me. The code does include a section on copyright and work for hire agreements. These sections are sound, but we're not attorneys. We aren't copyright attorneys. And the criteria for a valid work for hire agreement are very specific. So I encourage folks to read those sections, and if you have questions about your own rights, if you have questions about copyright, if you have questions about work for hire agreements, and whether or not it is fair or reasonable when you're being asked to sign them, I would love to hear from you. And I would love to refer folks. There's a few really good resources about work for hire and copyright that I can share after the webinar. But also, if this is something that AIR members still have confusion about, we want to know what kinds of questions folks have, because these are really important questions and they have a lot of impact on what you can do with tape that you gathered over the course of reporting a story. If you create something as a work for hire, the entity that hired you owns not only the work you produce, but anything that falls on the cutting room floor over the course of your edit. And there are some very specific legal restrictions that cover when a work for hire agreement is or is not acceptable, is or is not legally acceptable. But the Code of Fair Practice is very much a solid introduction, at least, to your rights. And the very last thing to keep in mind is that AIR can help. We are really committed to expanding our support for members on fair treatment and fair compensation. And so we absolutely need to hear from members about what has been hard and what has been frustrating. We can't solve every problem. We can't commit to intervening in every problem, but we do want to look for strategic ways to move, especially larger producers, and educate smaller producers on how to work fairly with independent contractors. I am actually going to pull up the code itself, and I encourage folks to do that. And also, I would super love to take any questions. And I'm very curious to know whether folks who've called in or have read the code already, have looked through it, or are just getting to know it now. I'm going to watch for questions, and I'm going to pull up the actual code of fair practice. Maybe. I think I have to stop my screen share to pull it up. Hang on 1 second. Okay, so I am going to just walk through a few of the things that I think are really important to both track and know as you go into freelance arrangements. One of the first sections of the code talks about living wage. This is something that we're very aware is a big issue, and that members increasingly need our support on. Lots of stations don't now pay what adds up to a living wage, and this is not that's fine. I'm really sorry. I think this is not a public page, and I was like, this is not in order. I'm going to switch to Chromium. I thought that was out of order. So the first line and paragraph, I thought these were alphabetical. The first thing that we assert is that commissioning entities, which is our kind of umbrella term for podcast production houses, radio stations, and anyone who's commissioning an independent producer or reporter or editor, should agree in advance on rights, rates, terms of payment, expectations for deliverables, timetables, and editorial control. Both parties should execute a written agreement or email before work commences. Our contract template is a great example of that. I always encourage people to actually sign a formal contract, but at minimum, you should always exchange an email that spells out in writing what you've agreed to. Annual rate review. If you are frequently contributing to the same show, station, podcast house, you should be expecting to reassess your rate at least once a year. It is reasonable to go to an editor and say, I've been here for a year, cost of living has increased, it's time for my rate to increase as well. Compensation, we talked about a little bit. Conflicts of interest is hugely important, and this is, I think, a more important piece to reflect on in terms of what production houses expect from you, the freelancer. You should always disclose any actual or potential conflicts of interest to an editor in advance of accepting assignment. And sometimes it won't be an issue. Sometimes they'll say that's fine. You can continue to report this. You can continue to tell the story. Sometimes they're going to say it's not, but it's more important to make sure that your editor knows than to keep something from an editor. And that's also true when things come up kind of late in the game. Consistency is something, especially for folks who work regularly for the same publication, who are working really big enterprise stories, just an acknowledgement that switching editors creates additional work, and that should be addressed. if a piece is being switched to a new editor, it is reasonable to go back to the show or station and say, hey, I've gone through an editorial process with my first editor, and switching to a new editor is going to create new work for me. And sort of estimate how many additional days of work is going to need to go into this. Correspondence, I think, is a small one and also a really big one, especially around newsrooms. Organizations should make a good faith effort to provide freelancers with listener correspondence related to produced work. You have a right to see what people are writing in about your work. I think that that's really important. It's absolutely something that writers expect at magazines, and you should be able to hear it. You should be able to brag about awesome things that people are saying to you. You should have a chance to respond to both awesome and negative things that people are saying about your work. Credit is also really important. As freelancers, credit is currency, and being able to show other folks what you worked on and what your role in it was is a really important part of building your practice. And shows have different policies about who they credit and when they credit them, but that it's reasonable to ask for credit on a show is really important to keep in mind. Exclusivity, again, this is a place where you should be communicating clearly about expectations. Most broadcast shows ask for a right of first airing. Most podcasts similarly ask for a right of first airing. Some shows and podcasts ask freelance contributors not to post a piece for a defined period, but it's important to make sure that you're clear on what their expectations are. And if you're planning to post something to your own portfolio, making sure that you're communicating really clearly about expectations. We talked a bunch about expenses already. Going concerns, if you're working together with an entity and are consistently providing content and stories, it's reasonable to sign a more global contract and then just reiterate your expectations about individual assignments as they come up. Indemnity is also incredibly important. We've seen a trend in mostly writing. I know Vox rather famously was asking freelance contributors to indemnify the publisher against any claims or legal actions resulting from their work, but they weren't offering mutual indemnity. So it was just the contract only said that the publisher was indemnified against any legal actions, but the contributor was not similarly indemnified. And that's a huge problem because it puts a huge amount of responsibility and risk on the shoulders of an independent contributor, and the publisher should be bearing that responsibility. It's always a reporter's responsibility for those news and reported pieces to fact check your work and follow the standards of reporting, especially when a commissioning organization has advertised those standards. But you should never be asked to indemnify a publisher or a podcast house or a radio station. Internships, I think it goes without saying, maybe it doesn't, that interns who take on work above and beyond the scope of their internship should be entitled to be compensated at the same rate as other freelance contributors, and should be communicating clearly about it. But if you're doing a newsroom internship and producing actual stories that go on the air, you should be getting paid for those stories. Interns should be a learning experience. It's not a source of free work. Kill fees are also, I think, really important. When a story isn't used, that you've produced for a single show, you are entitled to a kill fee. Usually it should be paid in full. And when a story is killed, you should be free to market that work to another outlet. Parallel to that, stories that are sitting on the shelf should not be left sitting on the shelf for great periods of time. Shows should be absolutely be clear with you about when a project is going to air, and if it gets bumped, They should be keeping you up to date on when it will air. And if they're really not going to air it, they should tell you, pay the kill fee and move on, so that you can move on as well. Payment periods, pitches, these are all, I mean, you can read all of these. Prior review is really important. That shows and productions should re-engage you as a freelancer when they're making big changes to a work after the final edit. Rights we talked about earlier in the webinar. Spec assignments, I talked about this at the beginning, but I'm going to talk about this again. The practice of commissioning work on spec is a practice of saying that, sure, we'll take the work if we like it when it's finished. And there are a lot of circumstances where that is reasonable, but it often revolves around taking a book to a publisher and saying, hey, will you publish my book? If someone is actually commissioning a project from you, it shouldn't be on spec. If you're coming to someone and saying, hey, I just did this, I've produced this story, I'm wondering if you want it, they're accepting it, you've essentially prepared it on spec. But if they've actually gone to the work of telling you what they want, talking about how this is going to fit with their show, asking you to go out and report something or develop a story, whether or not it's a reported story, they need to commit to paying you for that work. And it absolutely goes without saying that if you do commit to producing something on spec and it is not accepted for distribution, you're always absolutely free to resell that work. Standards of reporting is also really important. I am a former journalism professor, so that was especially important to me, but it's really up to commissioning editors to ensure that freelancers have access to organizational policies that cover ethical practices and journalism standards. But if you haven't seen those for an outlet that you're doing a lot of work with, you should ask for them. And you should read through them. And where there are things that you don't understand or you're not really sure it's consistent with their actual practice, that's a really important conversation to have. Transparency we talked about. Unanticipated additional work is another really important question and thing to address. If during the course of creating a piece, you and your editor agree that there's significantly more work needed to research, report another angle, gather material beyond the original expectation, you should renegotiate your rates. I think especially with kind of early career freelancers, it's very common to think, oh, you committed to doing this, and now the editor is saying that they need something wildly different, and you're just a little paralyzed by it because it's going to mean a huge amount of work, and you hadn't foreseen that when you agreed to produce the piece at the rate you had agreed to. It is reasonable to go back to the editor and say, I agree that the piece needs it. That's a huge amount of additional work. I'd like to renegotiate our pay agreement. Work for hire is kind of the flip side of copyright. I flagged it here. I actually think that the Wikipedia article, which I linked to there, is a really good summary of the restrictions on work for hire. But I will say that unless you're working in a staff capacity, in most cases, a work for hire agreement isn't valid. That doesn't mean that you should just sign it and assume that it will not be valid. But it does mean that you should raise some flags if you're being asked to sign work for hire agreements for folks who are paying you not by the piece, but by the day or by the week. The other thing that is important to flag is that freelancers in a work for hire relationship often negotiate retaining some rights, such as the right to use the work for promotional purposes. So it is reasonable to negotiate the right to include a piece on your own SoundCloud if you're producing a series of pieces for a podcast, for instance. And the last thing was also one of the ones that we started with, workplace harassment. Commissioning organizations are encouraged to review policies on respectful treatment and freedom from harassment policies to ensure that these policies extend to freelancers. So this is a place where we're going to be doing a lot of work with shows and stations to remind them that this is one of the obligations they have. If they're using a lot of freelance contributors, if editors are controlling the purse strings of a whole lot of independent contributors, they need to make sure that their existing workplace harassment policies are extended to those freelancers. And the last little bit down at the bottom is there's a bunch of guides to freelancers working in other mediums. So if you're diving into some writing or doing other work, those last few links might be really helpful. So with that, I'm wondering if we have any questions. I know that the folks who couldn't be here tonight from Boston, who are all at the Sonic Soiree, wanted to know if AIR is going to be more proactive about supporting members. And the answer is absolutely yes. I already spend not a huge amount of time, but a little bit of time helping folks figure out and kind of strategize around how to address a dispute. And we absolutely want to support members, and we want to hear from you if you are struggling to be treated fairly by the folks who you are working for. All right, so one of the things that I like to do when I'm teaching is do a last little, I'm going to count to 5 quietly and see if anybody has questions who maybe you're hesitant to ask. Really, any and all questions are welcome. And I will take questions about the rate guides as well if people have rate questions. All right, it seems like we don't have any questions at all. I hope that's because I was just so incredibly astoundingly clear. But I think Anne and I are probably going to hang out for another 20 minutes. I have completed the presentation, but we will hang out and see if any questions pop up. Haha, I knew it. We have a question. Is it possible to zoom out on the web page? Oh, sorry. Command minus. Okay, I'm not sure if that helped. The other thing that I will do is I will go ahead and drop the actual URL for the code into the type answer box. Other questions? I would love to hear from folks who did come about what, if you don't have to even phrase it as a question, but I'm curious about what brought you to a webinar on the Code of Fair Practice. Is it just general curiosity, or have you had a couple of experiences that you're not sure how to handle? Or are you new to freelancing and trying to figure out what expectations are?
Yeah, I'd like to pop in at this moment too to say that I can allow people to talk if anyone in the webinar right now wants to just pop into the chat and say like, hey, I'd like to say a few words in response to what Amanda is asking. I could turn on your microphone and you can share some thoughts that way.
The other thing that I'm going to go ahead and flag, and people should feel free to pop up with questions. Another really important project that I've been working on over the summer is establishing some updates to AIR's rate guides, and we published 2 more, I guess, chapters in our rate guide today. One is just a guide to establishing a day rate, which doesn't look at what radio stations currently expect to pay most often, but does look at the range of salaries that we saw in a pretty kind of directed survey of podcast production houses and radio stations. Some big networks, some small networks, and using those salaries to estimate a kind of reasonable day rate for someone working at that same salary range. So that's up, and it's a really great document for kind of making a case that your day rate should probably be higher than it is. So I encourage folks to take a look at that. And then we also put together a public radio, or just radio general, rate guide that maybe just answers all the questions I wanted answered the first time I looked at the radio rate guides that we had, but that includes some examples of the kinds of stories that we're talking about at different levels of complexity, and make some recommendations about reasonable rates for freelancers. These are all US based, and I know we have one UK caller, but so we sort of walk through, in addition to defining what NPR calls a level 1 story, what a lot of newsrooms would call an enterprise feature, and giving some examples of those kinds of stories that require some travel. They're going to take sometimes 5, sometimes more days to report out. It's a more complicated story to tell. News features, which are that sort of middle ground, they take a few days to report, but they're not a huge enterprise feature. And we have some examples of those. And then daily features, which are the kind of quick turnaround, day and a half stories, as well as some recommendations about that update our 2012 actual rate recommendations. So those are both up now. And we have 2 more rate guides in the works, and we're also working with, at this point, primarily radio stations, but also podcast houses to ensure that they're getting the rates that they expect to pay close to those fair rates. I think we can hang out for another couple of minutes and see if questions come up or surface.
A question that I've gotten actually from speaking with members in orientation phone calls and people who have seen the various iterations of the Code of Fair Practices is just kind of, they're just curious about the process by which AIR negotiated or spoke with commissioning entities to try to hash out certain parts of the code, because I know some of it we kind of came to a consensus with the working group, and then other parts were brought to commissioning entities to kind of find a middle ground there. So maybe that's an area where we can shed some light for people.
Sure. So as I think we said at the outset, this was most recently revised in 2015, and in early 2018, AIR convened a working group to update the code and rates. And I wasn't part of that process, but I know that, and now I'm sort of thinking, can I even tell you, do I even know what pieces were controversial? I know that there were some pieces that were very controversial, and some of the commissioning entities is such a bizarre phrase, but I couldn't come up with a better one. There was some real pushback from some of the shows and stations and production houses who just said this isn't consistent with how we work. And so the sort of first piece of my process was to take the document that had been worked on but not agreed on, and just check back in with the working group and with either the old contacts at those networks, or sometimes in some cases it was new contacts, just to sort of dial in where there were points of disagreement and what we were broadly in agreement on. And in most cases it was questions of phrasing, and it was pretty straightforward to come to a place where we could agree. but one thing, the reason why we have a very careful phrasing, representatives advised on early drafts of this code. In some cases, we couldn't connect with the folks who'd been part of the early process, and we knew that there was some disagreement, and we felt we'd addressed the disagreement, but we weren't sure. We certainly didn't feel that we could say that they'd endorsed the whole code itself. But then the next piece of our process was to open it up for comment from the AIR community, and some of the sections actually emerged during that comment period. So for instance, we hadn't included anything about credit because it hadn't come up in the kind of earlier iterations. And we heard from members that this was important and it was a source of frustration. And so the text that we actually added, we said credit is currency. While best practices in crediting contributors are part of an ongoing conversation, everyone who made a reasonable contribution to the production should be credited for their work. So that was something that sort of came in a little late in the process, but we felt that as a statement, it is a pretty lightweight statement. It doesn't say they have to be credited on the air. But that was added in to address some concerns from AIR members. I don't remember the other. I actually did. I bet I could find it. I did post a whole post to AIR Daily at the end of that comment period, summarizing the input that we'd gotten and the ways in which we updated the code to address that input. And it was I think it was a very empowering process for the membership. One of the things that we saw is that we didn't get a lot of feedback or input. And then on the very last day, I sent probably the 4th reminder saying this was your last chance to weigh in on the code. And suddenly there's a huge flurry of activity, and I could see that dozens of people opened it and were looking through the document. And so we extended, and I just kept extending the comment period until we stopped getting feedback, and then kind of address the feedback that we'd gotten. My hope is that going forward, we will hear more consistently and reliably from AIR members about where they are in conflict with producers, where they're finding that their expectations and a show or a production house's expectations are really divergent, and we can work with both members and with the folks who are commissioning work from AIR members to bridge some of those gaps. I think the first goal of the initial goal of this update to the code was to make sure that it really reflects the role of podcasts in the sort of income mix of our members. But there were a number of other concerns that don't have anything to do with podcasting that really came up in the course of working with the working group. Things like spec work, things like access to harassment policies. And so making sure that those were incorporated into the code was also important. So if there aren't any more questions, I think we can wrap this up. The code is online. It's airmedia.org/code of fair practice. And I am Amanda at airmedia.org, and I'm always super happy to hear from and check in with members about how things are going. Thanks a lot, everybody.